Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and host. Each program we talk about public policy issues, issues that are important for elections, and we hope you'll discuss those same issues. Then you'll be ready and willing to go vote at election time. This evening we have our topic is one that's been in the news recently because of the past election season. We're going to be talking about the Electoral College, what it is and what it isn't, what it does. And our guest is Dr. Carson Halloway, Professor of Political Science from the University of Nebraska Omaha. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Geri.
Well, let's dive right into it.
Sure.
And tell everyone, what is the Electoral College and what role does it play in our presidential elections?
Okay. The Electoral College is the institution or the mechanism by which the president is elected. Under the Constitution, the president's not elected by a direct popular vote of the individual citizens, but rather, I would say, roughly by the popular vote filtered through the Electoral College. So what happens is each state has a certain number of electoral votes that are awarded by a certain formula, and candidates win those electoral votes ordinarily by winning the popular vote in the state. And there's 538 total electoral votes. It takes 270 to win. And in addition to talking about just the votes themselves, I should also mention there are people involved in this. There are electors, right? The electors are chosen in the states to cast the votes for the winner of the popular vote in each state. And the Electoral College only exists for the purposes of electing the president. It doesn't do anything else. So it's just created each four-year election cycle for this purpose and then dissipates. And then new electors are elected the next time.
Okay. Well, I think it would surprise some people that we don't have a direct popular vote. And how was the Electoral College created? Why? Was it the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton? I think a lot of people are interested in Hamilton these days. That's come up. So.
Yeah, so Hamilton is connected to the Electoral College, although I don't know if I'd go so far as to say it's his brainchild. It was a compromise devised at the Constitutional Convention, of which Hamilton was a member and an active member, so he deserves part of the credit, or blame if you don't like the Electoral College. He's associated with it, though, too, because he wrote the Federalist paper that explains and defends the Electoral College. So the Federalist Papers are this journalistic enterprise that he undertook in New York State to explain and defend the Constitution, try to get people to vote for ratification. So it came about in the following way. As a compromise, as a lot of the constitutional provisions were compromises, there was some thought at the convention of electing the president by the Congress, but that lacked some support for reasons probably related to separation of powers. The idea was that if the president's elected by the Congress, he or she would be subservient to the Congress, and that would subvert this idea that we have checks and balances. So that didn't go anywhere. Another possibility would be the one that we discussed, a direct popular election, and if the founders did use that for the House of Representatives, a kind of a nationally based popular vote. So that idea was thought about, but that didn't work either in the end. There were various objections to it, and so this compromise was hammered out, whereby the Electoral College is the complex mechanism that filters in these different principles that they wanted to work in the election of the president. And one way of explaining it that's put forward by James Madison, Hamilton's collaborator on the Federalist Papers, is that it's intended to combine principles of representation. Madison argued the American Republic is a mixed and compound republic, meaning the following. It's not simply a national government, and it's not simply a confederacy. It's a combination of both. So if you lived in a national government, it would make sense to have a direct popular vote because then the government would be representing the people, period, of the nation. In a confederacy, it would make sense to have a vote state by state so that each state has one vote. In a confederacy, all the members are treated equally. We combine those principles in the legislative body, right? That you have one, the Senate represents the confederal principle, the House represents the national principle, and then last of all, the Electoral College and the mode of election of the president represents both those principles combined. So that I mentioned each state gets a certain number of votes in my answer to your previous question. Now I could tell you a little bit about the formula. It's basically that each state gets a number of electoral votes equal to their House delegation and their Senate delegation. So what's going on with the allocation of electoral votes is each state gets 3, really, simply for being a state. You know, you get 3 just for showing up, right, as a state, no matter how small you are. Rhode Island, Wyoming, which is very sparsely populated, they all get at least 3, and then you get more based upon population. So California, New York, Texas have much bigger electoral votes than the smaller states, but each state gets a certain bare minimum simply for being a kind of a co-equal member of the Confederacy, to that extent that we have one, right?
Okay. To what extent talk a little bit about, people have talked about slavery in the slave states having an effect that it was also done to keep them within the Union. So can you address that
Yeah, I think that was a factor. James Madison, again, in his notes on the convention, or some recollection later on, I can't remember which one, but Madison said the thought of a national popular vote was problematic to southern states because they knew they didn't have as much population and they would be outvoted by the northern states, and that was a matter of some anxiety for them. So I don't think they were inclined to support a direct popular vote for that reason. But it's not only that. I mean, I think all the smaller, less populated states had self-interested reasons to be in favor of the Electoral College, because it does magnify the political power of the smaller states. Not a huge amount, not as much as the Senate does, for example, where every state is treated absolutely equally, regardless of population, but to some extent. So I think slavery played a role. There's also the large state versus small state divide. And then, but also though, I think there was pretty good consensus on having this mixed and compound republic, that it would represent both principles of representation. It's interesting I mean, because we have controversies about the Electoral College because we're more believers now in sort of egalitarian democracy than the founders were. But in that Federalist paper, Hamilton says the Electoral College is just about perfect, and it's one of the least controversial parts of the Constitution. So at the time, there seems to have been a consensus that it was a pretty good way to go, even though disputes have arisen later on, based upon particular outcomes of elections to some extent.
Okay. Talk about another aspect of it, which I think that maybe a lot of people don't know about, which is that one provision was that it could help keep an unqualified candidate from becoming the president.
Yes, that's a good point. And this is an area where the Electoral College no longer works the way it was originally intended, because the way I explained it a few minutes ago and the way it works now is that the electors pretty much just vote the way they're instructed by their states. So if candidate A wins the popular vote in your state and you're an elector, you vote for candidate A, and they have slates of electors that are committed to the different partisan candidates. The founders really envisaged that the electors would deliberate about who to vote for. They'd be more independent agents. They would not all meet in one place. They would meet in the various state capitals. They'd be dispersed. But they wouldn't necessarily simply be responding to a popular vote, but they would think about it themselves and exercise their own discretion about this. So that would be a way of preventing an unsuitable candidate from being elected, the idea that you have a select appointment through the interposition of the judgment of the electors. And that presupposes that the electors would be, substantial people in the community that had been chosen somehow by those communities. Interestingly enough, the Constitution doesn't specify how the electors are to be chosen. It's up to the state to decide the method. So the electors could be elected by the people of the state, or they could be appointed by the state legislature, or some other method selected by law the state legislature chooses would result in the selection of the electors. But in any case, yeah, the original view was they would exert some kind of independent judgment, and that therefore only some kind of nationally known figure could emerge as the president, not just anybody, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're kind of saying it kind of works the way it's supposed to, but in some ways it's more like window dressing on our elections, at least modern elections.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think for one purpose it does work the way it was intended, and for the other purpose it doesn't, right? It does work just the way the founders envisioned or intended it, I think, in mixing principles of representation, right? The fact that every state gets a number of electoral votes based partly on their population, but partly based simply upon their identity as a state. That is functioning the way the founders thought it would. But in the 19th century, with the rise of Jacksonian democracy and much more emphasis on the popular vote and the people ruling, the popular vote became more important, and the idea of popular sovereignty became more important, and that's just not what they had in mind with the Electoral College, and so that's not functioning the way they intended, I don't think.
Okay. What happens if there's a tie in the Electoral College?
Well, if there were a tie, or if more generally one candidate did not get a majority, which could happen if you had multiple candidates, and did happen more often early in the history of the Republic, the provision is, and this is pretty interesting and most people don't know about this, but if no one receives a majority of the electoral votes, the election is thrown for the president into the House of Representatives. So the House will choose the president and the Senate will choose the vice president in that instance. And they don't choose them in exactly the same way. The senators get to vote individually for who the vice president will be, but the House members vote as state delegations. So each state casts a vote for the president if the thing is thrown into the House of Representatives.
Okay, so nothing simple about
No, it's
this
not.
at
It's pretty
all.
complicated. That's right.
Okay. Well, one problem, obviously, that people see with the Electoral College is that a candidate can lose the popular vote and still win in the Electoral College, which happened in this past election. I think it's the 5th time it's happened.
Right.
So can you talk about those 5 instances and what we should take away from that?
Sure, a little bit. The first one is really complicated and unusual because that's one where there were multiple candidates, I think at least 4. That's the 1824 election, I think, where Andrew Jackson did come in first in the popular vote, but he didn't get to be president. John Quincy Adams did. And then he came back, of course, in the next election and did win pretty big and got in there pretty solidly. And that's not a situation that's so likely to happen in modern times, I don't think, because even though we do have third-party candidates and maybe some independent candidacies, they just don't seem to pull that many votes, and I don't think we're going to have a situation like that in the foreseeable future. The others in the 19th century were also pretty unusual. The 1876 election, which is around the time of Reconstruction, and in that case, the Democrat, whose name is escaping me, beat the Republican, whose name is also escaping me at the moment, pretty handily. I mean, a couple million votes in the popular vote, but the Republican won anyway. That was a complicated one, though, because it's in the aftermath of the Civil War, and I think that a lot of the country thought that African Americans, for example, were being disenfranchised in the South, and if their votes had been counted properly, the Republican would have won. The Republicans are the party of Lincoln. Right after the Civil War, they're getting a lot of the African American vote. And that one, there was so much dispute in that case, it was thrown to an electoral commission that ended up deciding who the winner should be and recommending it to Congress. That's something I didn't mention in my earlier response. Congress gets to count the electoral votes. So if there's a dispute, Congress might refuse to accept a slate of electors and accept another one. And basically, because the Republicans controlled the Congress in 1876, they accepted every Republican slate in a case where it was disputed, so he won. Then it happened again in 1888, where I think that was William Henry Harrison beat Grover Cleveland. And that was a much closer one in terms of the popular vote, and I think you could take that as a fluke. And then more recently, we had it in 2000, where George W. Bush lost the popular vote fairly narrowly nationally, but still won. And he won the Electoral College very narrowly. It all came down to Florida, as many viewers will remember. And then most recently this time with Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, where Clinton won the popular vote, by, I can't remember, more than 2 million votes, right. I think.
Yes.
But strangely enough, Trump won the Electoral College quite handily. You got 304 votes in the end, I think 361 in term. There were some faithless electors, which we'll talk about later on.
Yes.
That's very rare. I mean, usually it's a close call on the popular vote and the electoral vote, and that just didn't happen in this case. So I guess what I would take away from it all is that it's a very rare occurrence that the candidate who wins the popular vote doesn't also win the electoral vote. And whether this is a new trend that could happen more in the future, or whether it's just kind of an unusual circumstance because of the unusual nature of the election, and you got kind of an unprecedented situation. I mean, Trump is a non-politician who got in, never having served in office, just kind of been a billionaire his whole life, or built himself into a billionaire, I guess. He's a very unusual candidate, and whether this could happen again in the future, I just don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Well, then you led right into something with this election that people talked about a lot when looking at the Electoral College. Faithless electors. What are they and what role can they play?
Right. So the whole idea of a faithless elector is a modern idea because it wouldn't apply to the Electoral College as the founders originally understood it, because the idea was that the electors would exert their own judgment.
Right.
So it really presupposes that the elector is bound by the popular vote in his or her own state or congressional district in certain cases. So a faithless elector then is an elector who doesn't vote as instructed. Right? And faithless electors are interesting, but they've never turned the outcome of an election. There have been a few here and there, just like in this election. Sometimes they don't cast their ballot for the person they've been instructed to support as a protest vote or something like that, or maybe because they object to the person, but they've never turned the outcome of an election.
Okay. And are there penalties for, people talked about financial penalties, or are there any other consequences in terms of being a faithless elector?
Right. That's a very interesting question, and it points once again to America's scheme of federalism, because it really depends upon the jurisdiction. Many states don't have any laws regulating the question of the elector's obligations. Now, in those states, it's still understood that you're supposed to vote for the majority. I mean, you're basically, these days, the electors are party functionaries who are chosen for this, on the basis of their loyalty to the party and their almost, I would say, near certainty to vote for the party's candidate if that candidate wins the popular vote. So sort of implicitly at least pledged to the party by signing up to be an elector. But not in every state is it the case that there's any kind of law requiring you to cast your vote the way the popular vote goes in your state. There are some states, 20-ish I think, that have a law to that effect, and then some sub-portion of those states have penalties attached. The penalties are not really huge, and they've rarely been applied, mostly because hardly anybody's ever a faithless elector, and when they are, it doesn't affect the outcome, so there's probably not much appetite to punish anybody for having done it. There was some talk in this election, because there was a kind of a push to get some of the electors to be faithless and to block Trump in the Electoral College. There was some talk of getting some people to do that and then testing those laws in the courts to see if a federal court would strike them down as somehow unconstitutional, but it never really came to that in this case.
Okay. Is there any other aspect of what the Electoral College does that could end up in the Supreme Court deciding?
Well, if there were a disputed election, it could come before the Supreme Court. And in a case like that, it's hard to know what the court would do. I mean, one line of argument could suggest that, well, the founders intended that the electors should be free, so therefore any effort to bind their votes is illegitimate. On the other hand, the Constitution does pretty much punt the selection of the electors to the states. It says they will be elected, or rather selected, according to a mode chosen by the state legislature, so that seems to suggest the legislature would have a lot of discretion about what kind of conditions it would impose. So it's hard to know what a Supreme Court or what any federal court would say about that question. And then as far as a disputed electoral outcome too, it's hard to predict what a Supreme Court would do, but one possible way of handling it, if you were the Supreme Court and you wanted to avoid being neck deep in partisan politics, which they often want to avoid, is to just note that Congress is empowered to count the electoral votes and to receive them and certify them. So you say, if there's a dispute, we'll just leave it to Congress to handle it. They'll decide which are the true electoral slates and who's really been seated and the rest of it.
Okay. So then the next question would be, is it time to abolish it? Is it time to get rid of the Electoral College?
Yeah, I think that depends upon whether you believe in plebiscitary democracy, right? I mean, and that's a very powerful argument in the modern world. I mean, it seems like the world has become, certainly the developed world has become more and more democratic, and certainly we're more insistent on popular sovereignty than even the founders were, and they believed in it sincerely, but they were not as scrupulous about it as we are. I think if you read the Federalist Papers at one point, they offer the definition of a republic as any government that is based upon the great body of the people. So as long as there's a lot of people voting, it's Republican enough for them. But the modern Supreme Court has defended the idea of one person, one vote in many instances, and a lot of people take that as their kind of baseline ethical expectation. So there would be kind of argument for getting rid of the Electoral College. On the other hand, a lot of people would oppose it on other kinds of arguments. I think they'd say something like, well, another thread in American political life is kind of reverence for the Constitution, and the mere fact that the Electoral College is what the Founding Fathers intended would be a powerful motive for many people to just keep it. And then, other people are just kind of pragmatists, and unless the Electoral College leads over and over and over again to outcomes that they find unacceptable, they might not be all that interested in revisiting the question. So I think it depends upon what your concerns are as to whether it's time to get rid of it.
Okay. Well, the League of Women Voters for a long time has supported abolishing the Electoral College, and I think mostly based on that one person, one vote philosophy, that's so strongly, we strongly believe in that. One interim measure that we would support and others do is something called the National Popular Vote Compact, and about a dozen states, I think, have signed on to that. Tell us about the compact. What would that mean?
The compact is, as I understand it, a voluntary agreement among states to throw their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. So it's a way of trying to achieve a national popular vote as determining the election of the president without having to reform the Constitution. Because to get rid of the Electoral College, you would have to amend the Constitution, which is very difficult to do. But what you might be able to do is just get states to voluntarily allocate their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. And it's sort of counterintuitive when you think of it, because we're so used to the idea that each state is going to award its electors to the winner of its own popular vote. That's sort of this kind of obvious thing, because it's what's always been done. But it doesn't have to be done that way. As I said before, Article 2 of the Constitution, which deals with the presidency and so lays out the Electoral College, says state legislatures can award electors however they want. They select them however they want. So they could peg it to, I mean, if you wanted to be silly about it, I mean, one state could peg it to what another state decided to do. No one would do that, of course, but I'm just trying to emphasize their absolute discretion over this, it seems. So they could peg it to the national popular vote. And some states have made a move to do that. It's sort of, at this stage, hypothetical in the following senses. One is, it would only be triggered if the situation arose where the popular vote would be frustrated by the Electoral College, and that instead they want the outcome to be determined by the national popular vote. So it's this hypothetical agreement to trigger this in the situation where it would emerge. And the other thing is, not enough states have yet really signed on to it. I think you said a dozen, 10, or yeah. I think the District of Columbia is in there. There are other states that have legislation introduced to do it, but not any more have taken it up yet. Perhaps some will in view of this election, where again we had the popular vote going in the other direction from the electoral vote. It's kind of it's a little bit of a steep hill to climb, though, because it does run up against the interests of the smaller states, right? We talked about that earlier. It's in their interest to have a little bit more power, and people tend to be reluctant to give it up. And that's the impediment too, I think, to a constitutional amendment. I mean, it could be done, but it's a tough one.
Another way that people look at changing things with the Electoral College is most states are winner take all, as you explained, but there are two states, Maine and Nebraska, where we don't do it that way. We do award it based on who won the popular vote in a particular congressional district. And I understand Virginia is looking at moving to that today. They someone introduced legislation to do just that. What about that idea? How is that better than what we have?
It's hard to say how it would play out. It would tend to, perhaps, make the electoral outcome more closely track with the popular vote. Of course, it's tracked with it in most cases anyway, but it might be it'd be narrower that way, because you wouldn't, I mean, winner take all means that the whole electoral delegation of the state is achieved by the person who wins just one more vote, right? Even if they win only by a single vote out of millions cast, they still get all of those electoral votes, and the other candidate gets 0, right? So these disproportions arise. So if you broke it down by congressional district, you would eliminate some of that. And what Nebraska and Maine do is even a little more complicated, and this is what other states might do, is they award 2, which would be kind of the equivalent to the 2 that are for their senators, on the basis of the statewide vote, but then they award the others on the basis of the congressional district. And if we were to do that, it would lead to a lot of, our national politics, or I should say presidential campaigning, would be a lot different, because as it is now, because of the winner-take-all system, for example, the Democratic candidate, say Hillary Clinton in the last election, not going to spend a lot of time in Texas because you're probably going to lose it. You're not going to get any of those electoral votes. Conversely, Trump is not going to go to California because traditionally Republicans lose California, and you're not going to get any electoral votes out of California. Whereas if you did this approach that you were talking about and allocate them in the states by congressional district, well, there would be some congressional districts that Trump would win in California. Hillary would win some in Texas, because I mean, they don't win 100% of the popular vote in those states, right? There are some Republicans in California and some Democrats, many Democrats, in Texas. So I think it would change how they campaign. They would go into these states that they ordinarily don't go into, and they would focus on, I think, certain congressional districts where they think they could win. And it would really take, experts to figure out, right? You would really want well-trained campaign managers to figure out which ones you can target. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to figure out. You'd go on the basis of past elections, but it would require a rethinking.
Okay. Now, I know that when the 2020 census comes out, the Census Bureau actually determines what the formula will be for electors for the states, and that'll be the first election that'll be affected will be 2024.
Right.
Do you see anything, any changes, anticipate anything there?
I think nothing big, but there will be changes. It seems every census we find that some states have lost population proportional to others, and since we have a set number of electors or electoral votes, some states gain electoral votes and others lose some. Some states gain congressional districts, some states lose congressional districts if they've lost enough population. So I suppose the overall lay of the land will look the same. I mean, the big targets will be Texas, California, New York, and there will be some changes at the margins, but not enough that I think it would change kind of the red state, blue state map will still look about the same, and the parties will start with the same competitive advantages or disadvantages, I think, that they've had in the past. But gradually it'll change.
Okay. So really you feel the Electoral College is here to stay?
That's my instinct so far because of what I said earlier about the thing is, it's difficult to amend the Constitution. If you wanted to do it that way, you have to get a supermajority in both houses of Congress, a supermajority of the states to approve the proposed constitutional amendment, unless you had a constitutional convention, which would be another way to go, but I don't think anybody wants to do that because who knows what they would propose. Right. And even if you did that, in the end, you'd have to get a supermajority of states. So it would just be hard to get there, given two things, I think. One, the self-interest of the small states, whose power is magnified a little bit by the Electoral College. And then also just the pragmatism of Americans. I think the ones who turn the scales are basically such that they don't operate on the basis of the other kinds of principles that the other voters think about, but they're sort of like, if it led to bad outcomes over and over again, they would be in favor of it.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if it led to those outcomes, they would just not vote for that candidate.
We need to stop here,
Okay.
So thank you so much for being here and talking about that. Well, we can't let this first show of 2017 end without us saying something about Jim Nelson. Jim was the station director here at KPAO, and he died on January 4th. The Go Vote Omaha would not be in existence without Jim Nelson. He was a very patient teacher, a mentor. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was our friend. And Go Vote Omaha crew, we miss him greatly. For the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon.